Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the Oasis Focus on Finance show. I'm your host Shafiq Morton. As always, it's good to be with you. In today's show, we have a look at something called food security. According to the United Nations, food security means safe and secure access to food for all people at all times. And of course, that food has to be nutritious and it has to be able to afford a person a healthy lifestyle. In today's show, we're going to have a look at what exactly is food security given the light of climate change. We'll also have a look at food security in the South African context. But to help us understand all of this are Michael Swingler and Hassan Motala. Assalamu alaikum. Good day, Michael.
Good day.
Wa alaikum salam.
Michael, let's kick off with you. When policymakers refer to something called food security, what exactly are they talking about?
Shafiq, if I can maybe start from a global context, and then later Hassan will focus a bit more on the South African context. But as you said in the intro, there is a definition provided by the United Nations Committee on World Food Security, and it reads that all members of the population, this is in every country globally,
Right,
should have access to a sufficient amount of food that has adequate nutritional value and is safe to consume. So that is the definition. And if we maybe expand that a little bit, food availability is really about the local supply. You know, that countries have sufficient local supply. Food access is really about the entire population. All levels of the population would have the means to secure the food, whether that is through a market place or there could be other programs that governments put in place, but they have the means and to secure the food. And then lastly, as you've also indicated in your intro, which I think is very relevant for South Africa, is that the food must be safe to consume and that it will not result and have a detrimental impact on the population. So with us then sharing the our understanding of the definition, I think the next step in terms of food security is that we look at the risks and explain to our viewers what can cause problems with food security. And it really comes down to natural disasters and then also man-made or human disasters. The obvious one, and we've experienced it firsthand locally in the last 2 years, has been the drought. But we must remember that weather conditions and drought elsewhere also impacts on the global demand and supply of certain food commodities. And what really happens at the end of the day is if there are adverse weather conditions, you end up with a shortage in a commodity and then a food commodity, and that results in prices increasing significantly. And that could result in large parts of the population not being able to access that food commodity. The second one that I want to raise would just be poverty. And again, we'll talk a little bit more in detail about South Africa. But if we look at the policy in that, using that as an example, in our lower income groups, in our vulnerable segments of our communities, the government has put in place a significant social grant structure. And the biggest component of that social grant structure is going towards the vulnerable portions of the South African population being able to still access their food commodities. And there are 17 million South Africans on social grants. So there I think our government has done a decent job in ensuring that the vulnerable parts of our communities still have access and have food security. If I look at other key item, it's really civil unrest and conflict that impacts on food security, because then farmers are not able to access their land or use their land. Let's take Mozambique as an example, where during the war in the 80s, a lot of landmines were placed during that war, and farmers were not able to access that land. That can cause serious risks to food security. Lastly, if I can just maybe end off on my initial section with policy and how important policy is. Because if we look at drought, the policy globally, but also within different continents and countries on climate change, if we look a little bit ahead, that's going to be critical on ensuring food security. It's going to be devastating to food security if we don't get it right. If we look at the growing population, we must remember that the population is growing significantly, especially if you look at the growth over decades, over 10-year periods. But the land available stays the same. So there, it's very important, and we will talk about it again a bit later, about making land available and ensuring that farming is productive and that the productivity increases over time, because your population will continue to grow, but you only have the same amount of land available. So those policies, government policy globally, impacts on us and our viewers, but it also, over time, that's the policy responses to these challenges are going to be vital to ensure food security.
Now, Hassan, Michael has given us a very comprehensive backgrounding to the whole issue of food security. To be more specific, how does this impact us, and how important is this for us in South Africa?
The drought has had a very, very big impact on us. Firstly, in Cape Town, we're still going through the drought. Remember our dam levels, just driving past this morning, you can see they're 16.6% our dam levels.
And the grapes have become raisins.
Exactly. So it's a big issue. In the sense that, Michael's talked about there's natural and there's man-made. Now, from a South African perspective, this natural impact that we had in the last 2 years, the drought, had a big impact on, particularly, if you look at the crop of maize. Maize has a big impact on various aspects in terms of food. Maize feeds into so many different aspects in terms of food.
No, absolutely.
Right. Now, if you look at the last year, 2015, 2016, maize prices rocketed. On the back of maize production having come back, South Africa was in fact short of maize and had to actually import maize during the past year. Now, with the result of, because of the shortage, maize prices shot up, it fed into various aspects of food prices, and therefore inflation was above the band of 6% that the Reserve Bank looks at in terms of the inflation. So it impacted everyone. So and particularly if you look at, the segment of society which is most impacted is your lower and middle income, because a bigger part of your paycheck is going towards food. Food for you, your family, it goes towards that. Now with food prices, we saw in many areas, food prices moved up very strongly, and therefore had a big impact on your budget and your standard of living. And that's an important point. So from that perspective, if you look at it, food security is very important, because we need to ensure that our production of various parts of food or various aspects of food, we have a very secure supply of that. Maize was just giving you the one example where we had an impact, it related and it fed throughout but this was obviously a natural impact. Now, alhamdulillah, this year it looks like, and the expectations are, that maize is going to be a fantastic product. Fantastic production is going to expect it, because you had good rains in many of the maize producing areas in South Africa. Now see, if we produce and we do it right, it has a greater impact, because if maize comes through, and let's hope inshallah that we do get that production coming through, you're going to see a related impact in food prices, that food inflation starts to come back, and that benefits all people. And it's important. So from that perspective, security is good, because firstly, you have a secure supply of food. You're not reliant on anyone or any particular country or any individual to give you that there. That's an important point. Remember that if you're reliant on imports, you place yourself under pressure, because not only firstly that you're reliant on them, there may be an issue in terms of trade relations. Remember what's happening globally at the moment. Trump is placing his policies and saying we will trade with these people and not trade with they can have impacts like that. Not too long, and I'll touch on that later on in terms of how South Africa had some challenges on the poultry side. But the other challenge around imports is currency. We're having to buy goods outside of the country using foreign currency, dollars, euros. Now, if our currency comes under pressure, the cost of those goods also is impacted. So again, feeding to inflation, feeding into the cost of goods. So food security from a national perspective, from a South African perspective, very important. And I'm going to stress a bit later as to why agriculture is so important in this country. We talk about agriculture and we've seen it, in history. Agriculture plays an important part, but we'll address that a bit later in the show.
Michael, I think this is important. How do other countries deal with the issue of food security? Because it is critical, isn't it?
Yes, it is, Shafiq. And let me use two examples. And this ties in with what we spoke earlier about policy. So I'd first like to use the Food and Drug Administration in the US. So this is if we look at developed market examples, this is an example of an agency that controls the movement of food products into the US and out of the US. And then we can maybe look at the second example, which is the Common Agricultural Policy that is implemented under the European Commission. So what are they trying to achieve here? I think there are two or three objectives. Firstly, to ensure that there's sufficient local supply. And it's about encouraging local supply. It even goes further, and this is where it can cause imbalances. If we look at the US, for example, their subsidies, and this is money that is provided to local farmers, is between $10 and $12 billion a year. The numbers are very significant in Europe. So I'm just contrasting that with South Africa. If our government is not supporting local farmers, we will be, or less support than in other countries globally, our farmers will be at a disadvantage. So their agencies and their policies support local farmers and local supply. And then secondly, I think the key is to protect local jobs. So the key for South Africa, I think, is to remain competitive in that kind of environment. Where, and to remain competitive, just take our fruit, for example. It's very sought after in your global markets. So our farmers need to remain competitive, and where necessary, government needs to provide the policies and support to ensure that they remain competitive so that the products can get to these global markets. But we also need to be vigilant, and our policies need to be enforced to ensure that other countries don't dump food commodities in South Africa, which results in our local farmers' businesses not being sustainable, because then we will see job losses.
Now, Hassan, food quality is a huge issue. I mean, food quality, I think, is one of the main things in terms of food security. So how do we understand respective differences in terms of local and global?
From a South African perspective, very importantly, there are very stringent requirements and sort of policies that have been put in place. So for example, you can't use, in South Africa, certain insecticides are banned and you cannot use it. So obviously from a health perspective, it has a big impact. So you know that, whatever product or not you're eating, there's a, probability that you're not going to be impacted by that because certain of those insecticides are being banned. Secondly, for example, there's very stringent requirements in many of your meat processing and plants and the like. So I'll give you an example. For example, in 2015, the Department of Agriculture introduced, in poultry, especially you get this brining issue. Either it's brining of poultry or you see it in your tin products, you see tuna fish is in brine and the like. So brine is like, basically salted water.
Very fancy word for
Very
salt.
fancy word for salted water, exactly. So basically many poultry producers inject poultry with brine. They say to keep it sort of fleshy and soft and the like. But the problem is, if you inject a lot of brine, effectively speaking, the weight is being inflated by the like of more brine rather than actual poultry flesh per se. So that's why there was a cap of maximum of 15%. Now, in many countries in the world, that's not adhered to. Where you've got a substantial portion of the bird that actually has a high proportion of brine rather than the flesh itself.
And it melts away in the pot.
It melts away. So for example, when people are importing some of these products into the country, so the weight, for example, maybe 2 kilos is box product of frozen poultry, 2 kilos. Guess what? Probably maybe 25-30% of that weight is water.
Mm-hmm.
So are you getting a quality product that's coming through? Now, I'm going to touch on poultry in particular because it's an area which has been in the media and it's been talked about a lot. You know, firstly, the fact of how poultry, in terms of the quality of poultry that's coming into the country and how it impacts obviously the local market and the local production that comes through. Now, you would have noted in the media very recently, 2 key areas where we've had imports into the country from Brazil and EU. Now, very recently, and it's happened in the media, you would have noted it recently, Brazil in particular, there's been, and other countries have now implemented some sort of restrictions on Brazilian imports because there had come to light that certain Brazilian exports that are going to many countries in the world were actually old chicken. And we're not talking old as in days old or months old type of chicken. We're talking in certain cases years old chicken. That's what were being exported. And what was happening was years old chicken, they were basically using chemicals to sort of mask the fact that they were old chicken. And guess what? People were eating it in countries. You don't know it because it's masked, it's coming into your country, it's been proved that it's been fit for consumption, but it was masked by chemicals. And officials in Brazil, there's now bribery charges and the like that's going into place, which obviously being investigated. Now, local production, not secure, but stringent regulations, stringent requirements, you know, the risk of that is reduced substantially. Secondly, with the EU, you've had recently the avian flu. Now, again, from a poultry perspective, the risk around avian flu and that coming into your country, impacting the consumers that consume that type of poultry. Again, restrictions have been put in place to ensure that we're not impacted by that. So quality of product is very important from that perspective. And therefore, that's why the local producers, by complying with these stringent requirements and regulations, ensures that the risk to us, all of us that are eating poultry or red meat, whatever it may be, that we are basically getting the higher quality product and reducing the risk of being impacted by that. So I think that's particularly a very important point. The second point, obviously, just to highlight is obviously from a local production perspective, the impact in the economy in terms of jobs creation. You remember a lot of the poultry plants and the processing plants and the meat production plants, they have obviously employ many people out there.
They're labor intensive. Actually.
Labor intensive, exactly.
Yeah.
If I just expand it to not only in our poultry, but even Michael highlighted earlier, the likes of the fruit and the vegetables. You know, if you walk into a supermarket in London or if you walk into a supermarket in Dubai, there's a good probability that you will find either an apple or a grape or the like that's coming from South Africa. Why? Because the quality of our products that are being exported and that are being produced are of a high quality. And guess what? Besides being of a high quality, they're employing many people in the country. And if we can focus on that and improve that and expand that, it has an impact on the lives of many, many South Africans, not only from an employment perspective, but also from what we're consuming. We're eating a high quality product. It impacts our quality of health and it therefore has a related impact on our standard of living. And therefore, I think that's an important point, and important points to highlight as well.
Indeed. Michael, are there any ways in which we could perhaps improve on food security?
Technology. So I think more South Africa, and that's the private sector plus government, more investment should go into research on agricultural production and improving production. Other areas which I think is important, is again the private sector, the farmers. They should prioritize the local market and first supply the local market before they export. And then secondly, tying in with what Hassan said, government should enforce the rules that are in place. The rules are there, but enforce the rules strictly to ensure that any product that is imported is of a high quality and it is safe. Then lastly, if I look at the bigger policies, we still have a lot to do in terms of land redistribution in South Africa, but I think it needs to be accompanied by, and here again the private sector needs to take the hand of emerging farmers. It needs to be accompanied by a process to skill up emerging farmers, and it needs to have an angle to it where the safety and security of farmers can be assured, and also the conditions of farm workers can be improved. So that's quite a lot that we still need to do in South Africa.
Now, Hassan, Michael has essentially said local is lekker, hasn't he? How in the local context can we source, grow, and actually improve our landscape of food security?
Sure. Agriculture is a very, very important aspect of any economy in the world. And I think from a South African context, it's extremely important. Don't underestimate it. It has a big impact in terms of jobs. It has a big impact in terms of contributing to economic growth. Let us not lose that impact. Now, we talked about earlier that there's 17 million people that are receiving some form of social grant in South Africa. Now, we do have many people out there. Let us transfer, the skills around agriculture to many people that are unemployed. We do have a high unemployment rate in South Africa, high level of unemployed people. If there's a transfer and a skilling up of people that come from that background, be it from the disadvantaged background, be it from the rural areas, be it from, many women are unemployed. Here's where we can basically upskill our women out there, and they can obviously contribute meaningfully and have a substantial contribution towards economic growth. Now, if you look at it from this perspective, you've got obviously commercial farming and you also have subsistence farming. Subsistence farming, if the right skills are in place, they can have an impact in terms of ensuring good local production. We go to these many of these Saturday markets and the like, where we love organic fruit and organic this and the like. Organic is what? Producing it, taking care, doing it nicely, and doing it with the utmost love. We can do it in terms of many people, and from a subsistence perspective, you can actually benefit from that. Right. And by getting the right skills. Ensuring that there's good training and skills and programs put in place to ensure that a bigger part of the population benefit from that, and therefore they're producing for their families, they're producing also to sell in the local markets, and they're producing to ensure that South Africa we can sustainably live on produce that is coming from our country. And it has a good impact on society, on the country, and the economy.
Good for that. Hassan and Michael, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shafiq.
A special thanks to our special guests today, Hassan Motala and Michael Swingler, for discussing the very important topic of food security. Should you wish to watch this or any of our other shows, you can log in to the Oasis Crescent YouTube channel. Should you wish to contact us, you can dial 0860 100 786 or info@oasiscrescent.com. From myself, Shafiq Morton, until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.